people. So, or what do you remember of your time as a fellow in IAS?
Oh, I remember it as a sort of golden 3 months. I had a wonderful time. I was there at a moment when sort of visual studies were really coalescing in Durham. I was working with the late lamented Andrea Noble, Jonathan Long and Ed Walsh. And we just had long conversations into the night. I just finished the book, The Camera's Historian, and I was sort of trying to open up around the questions that had raised, but I hadn't been able to address in that book. It was very much a sort of ethnographic incision into a historical moment. And it raised all sorts of questions that I couldn't answer in that book. And in fact, I'm just coming back to this, but it was really interesting because my time at IAS really exposed me to completely different disciplines, psychologists, Dante scholars, who thought brilliantly, but in a completely different way. And I'd always had a feeling that the problem with visual studies, photographic studies, that in a way it's quite inward looking. It develops its own theory. Now, you can see that this was a sort of act of, what Stuart Hall calls strategic essentialism. We had to do it. Nobody took us seriously, 20 years ago. And so there was a body of theory developing, but it was actually quite inward looking. And I felt, well, yeah, this is great as far as it goes, but there are all sorts of other issues out there that impinge on the visual, impinge on photography, and we're not really answering them because we're looking inwards into the medium. And there was this sort of long arm of influence from art history that was looking at medium specificity. And I was always interested in asking the question, what happens if we intersect a given concept with the existence of photography? And so that interdisciplinary environment at IAS was absolutely wonderful, because I encountered sets of ideas that I could then say, yeah, let's take this idea and see what happens when we just intersect it with photography and see what the implications are for, say, that study, or indeed photography itself. And I suppose these ideas have been bubbling on for the last 10 years since I was at IAS, and really found fruition in my most recent book, when I'm looking at the way photography has an impact on the sort of commonplace concepts of historical study in its broadest sense. I think it also gave me confidence to do that, because I've been thinking about it and I've been working in anthropology, and I think it gave me the confidence to sort of grab anthropological concepts, particularly things like divisibility, dispersion. I mean, Alfred Gell, everybody's reading Alfred Gell at the time, and how those concepts actually intersected with the very existence of photography, and how we could think about what photographs do in different ways. And yeah, I wasn't alone in this. I mean, you mentioned Chris Pinney. I mean, he was working in the same direction, because I think we were very concerned with how a certain sort of cultural studies Foucauldian model was being dumped on photography, which, coming from anthropology, seemed to disenfranchise the very people it was meant to speak for, in that it closed down their history. So I was very interested in finding a different language to think about photography. And this is why I became very interested in the notion of presence. And whilst I was at IAS, the Dutch theoretician of history, Elke Runnia, came and gave a sort of masterclass and a public lecture. And I had the somewhat frightening task from IAS of responding to him. But it was his work on notions of presence.
People, it's a big thing for a lot of people.
Yeah. Yes.
And in that way, you talk about the role of presence emerging in your book, but also in terms of while you were at the IAS, what has been the trajectory till now or going forward? in terms of where you are taking your work?
Well, I'm retired now, which is rather nice because I can devote myself to projects that really interest me.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't have to dance to the tune of the ref. And what I'm doing now is that the recent book is kind of my lockdown book that I could write sitting in my study. And that's, as I said, the culmination of something I've been thinking about for a very, very long time. What I'm doing next, I think, again, is very interdisciplinary, very much around visual culture. And I'm picking up those questions that I mentioned right at the beginning around the camera as historian, the things that I didn't address in the camera as historian, which was very much, as I said, a vertical incision. It was a very detailed ethnography. What I want to do now is pick up those questions and look at it on the horizontal axis. And I want to look at the role of photographs in the emergence of what we now call public history or heritage. And if one reads the textbooks, the suggestion is that this is something that emerged in the United States and Australia round about the end of the Second World War, and it becomes professionalized and managerialized through the 1950s, 60s and onwards. But if you start looking at the history of this, it's actually got a much deeper history, and it's entangled with that book, The Camera's Historian. So I'm looking at sites where history performs itself photographically, but isn't necessarily noticed. I'm interested in the visible invisibility of photographs in that public space. I'm looking at crazy things like streets and railway carriages and school reward cards and public libraries and museum postcards and all these sites where history is being made visible within the public domain, and audiences are being constructed, but it's not necessarily in a particularly, it doesn't necessarily map onto a kind of public intentionality, let's put it like that. And so I'm using a lot of things like Nigel Thrift's non-representational theory, where he talks about precognitive cognition, and then Derek McCormack, another geographer, who talks about atmospheres of absorption. And so I'm very interested in how that works in the role of photographs in that visibility. Because, I mean, take railway carriages. I mean, you think this is a ridiculous thing to do, but I'm old enough to remember when there were photographs in railway carriages. And this goes right back really into the 1890s at least. And it was linked to tourism, but it's always around historical sites. And I found this wonderful photograph at the National Railway Museum of a third-class railway carriage with these great big panoramic views of Kirkstall Abbey in Leeds, which is a wonderful one because it was the first monastic remain to go into public ownership under the long story, I won't bore you with it. And then these carriages were often turned into troop carriers in the First World War, but they didn't take the photos out. So people coming back into the front with this photographic statement of what they were fighting for. I mean, it's really interesting when you start sort of thinking about how people saw them, what these photographs did. So that's an example of the kind of thing I'm looking at. It sounds kind of crazy, but the idea is it all knits together in these sort of little micro histories of invisible visibility, or in some cases, more visible visibility, to understand how photographs are absolutely instrumental in building things like a public acceptance of state guardianship of monuments and things like that. So it's going to be very, very anthropologically informed. I've written about half of it.
Sounds great. Sounds
It's my
great.
fun project
Yeah.
because
Yes.
the archival work is such fun. It's so interesting. It takes me into most extraordinary places, finding things that are really almost below the archival radar. And I think, how these sorts of histories become institutionalized is quite interesting, because I find that I'm digging in really strange corners because they're not formally archived in many cases. So this is why I always think of the archive as fieldwork site.
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely.
Yeah.
And also because the archive is made by someone, like as
Exactly.
historians would
Yeah.
say, to think of it as
Exactly.
a site
Yeah.
of authenticity is also being massively questioned in terms of the
Yeah.
archive fever.
It
Right?
has, and this is why I think the time is ripe to actually look at our assumptions around heritage and public history, because I think this has been building for almost 100 years, longer than everybody thinks it's been building. And I'm stopping the study in 1939 because everything goes into abeyance with the Second World War. And once we get to about 1947, people start publishing guidebooks and things again, because paper rationing goes off. You begin to get the build of what we now recognize as the heritage industry, which really didn't operate in that way until after the Second World War. And indeed, interestingly, at least in this country, the word heritage is very seldom used before the Second World War. Occasionally, but it's always our history or our monuments, but this very, very strong sense of possession. So, a lot of the work coming out of anthropology in material culture studies, I think, is going to be very, very important here.
You've intersected photographs with, which are really different.
Yes, I'm always a little bit worried about picking up scientific concepts from, say, physics or astronomy and running with them, because I'm not sure I fully understand them. But I have employed some as metaphors. I think, picking up on Ray Fogelson's work on non-event, which comes from physics, I think is a very interesting one, because it goes back to your question about absences. But non-event is a way of, I dread all the physicists listening to this, because I was like, no, you don't understand it at all. So I hope this concept isn't very, very mangled, but it's something that doesn't happen, but theoretically, it should or could happen, and it leaves some sort of trace. And I think absences in photographs, or photographs of things that seem incredibly banal and you don't know what they could ever mean, or even if they're interesting. I think non-event is a very interesting concept to use with these, and as I say, Fogelson uses it. I've also used some concepts out of geometry about how tangents work and how, but I'm always a little bit wary about it, because the danger of all interdisciplinarity is that we cherry pick in each other's disciplines without fully understanding the context of the work. And this certainly happens in photographic theory, for instance. It's just become cited as a sort of cozy canon and a mantra. And you sometimes wonder if people have actually read it. And I'm always a little bit, I do get very agitated somehow that, it's somehow humanities have to follow STEM and dance to their agenda. I would love to see some projects that are initiated out of the humanities and have science as the add-on.
Yeah, exactly.
As the added value, rather than just saying, oh, we'll commission an artist to do this. I think actually there's a room for much closer conceptual work in that false dichotomy between humanities and science, because I do think
absolutely
it's a false dichotomy, and I think it's in there structurally. It's how research councils and money are organized. It's how government departments think. It's how universities and libraries organize themselves. But actually, I don't think it pertains any longer. And this is what
on that. Sorry, I interrupted you.
I just said without anyone even thinking about it.
Yeah.
And this is why I'm interested in the dispersed and distributed object.
Yeah.
Because you see those sort of micro activities of the image as they perform in different spaces. And as you say, often with different captions or no captions. And then there's the question of how do we read no caption?
Exactly. What are the signifiers? Yeah.
Because it can be a marker of profound distance and suppression and oppression, or it can be a marker of profound intimacy. In that we don't need to caption because it's in our heads and in our hearts and in our voices.
Yeah.
And
that's right.
you know, how do you read it?
Exactly. Or in our memories, we know what that
our memories
is
exactly.
About.
Yeah.
But I'm really looking forward to actually the event that we have now with Professor Elizabeth Edwards on the 11th of October on her new book, an event which has been organized by Center for Visual Cultures and IAS.